Hi guys, this is Mr. Tan, and today we are doing crisis management in the hospitality sector. And we are going to cover the assignment 1 questions. So we're going to be looking at the patterns and relationships of thematic areas, communication tools and communication strategies, and models of crisis management. It's mainly focusing on the Faulkner and the phase model. So the first question says to investigate patterns and relationships between parts of various thematic areas where crisis management in tourism and hospitality merges. So we're going to be breaking this down in terms of what's required here. Patterns and behaviors in thematic areas where crisis occurs. So what area specifically, what is the crisis, and how does it affect tourism and hospitality? The second learning outcome says to analyze communication tools and strategies used by tourism organizations or tourist destinations to manage effective recovery from crisis. So here we're looking at two different things in terms of communication tools and also communication strategies that can be used by organizations or destinations to really manage effective recovery from the crisis. Third learning outcome says to apply theoretical approaches of crisis management in tourism and hospitality in a real situation. So obviously you have to apply real situations to this, and when we say theoretical approaches, we're talking about using different models, and the two models we're going to be focusing on and using examples and breaking down will be the Faulkner model and the phase model of crisis management. It's also important to understand in the learning outcomes there are various key words. So learning outcome 1, the key word here is to investigate, which means to carry out a systematic or formal inquiry to discover and examine the facts. In terms of the second learning outcome, the key word here is to analyze. Analyze means how one factor affects another. How does one variable affect another? And then in the third learning outcome, the key word here is to apply, and show with examples how the models apply to the tourism and hospitality industry. So the first assignment for this unit, crisis management, is a poster viva, which is 1500 words plus or minus 10%. So you have to use in-text referencing within the post and provide a reference list. And you need to do a few things here. You need to show how with facts and figures within the last 10 years at least minimum of 2 different areas of crisis in different thematic areas where this has occurred, and we really need the facts and figures here. What actually happened? How many tourists used to come before the crisis in that thematic area? How many tourists were after that area? How many domestic tourists? How many international tourists? How many? How did it affect their spend, and how did it affect the GDP? How did it affect the employment? How did it affect the infrastructure? So we need facts, figures, and details of this. So you can pick a few if you want, but you really need to give the details of those thematic areas in the crisis. Also within the model here, you can see that you need to cover the communication tools and the communication strategies. And then the Faulkner model and the phase model, you need 2 models because it says apply different theoretical approaches, which is plural. So you need to have a minimum of 2 theoretical approaches. And you really need to break down the models and then show with examples from your different crisis and thematic area how they relate to different sections of the model, and also show how the different communication tools and strategies can also relate to the different sections of the different theoretical models, in this instance the Faulkner model and the phase model. We can see another example in terms of what a student has done. Here in the bottom left we can see the phase model being used. We can see the Faulkner model in the bottom right, and they break down the different sections. Again, you can see communication tools. You can, at the top, you can see different crises and thematic areas. I mean, I would really focus on fewer thematic areas but more detail in terms of what happened in those areas. And then kind of like in the middle, you've got more communication tools and strategies. Another example can be seen with the Emirates one. Again, not everything is really covered here, but you can see an example of, at the bottom, different thematic areas and crises. We can see communication in terms of do's and don'ts, and at the top you can see the Faulkner model. But for me, this example is not really complete, and there's no interaction, interlink between the different sections, because in Learning Outcome 3 it says apply the different theoretical approaches. So how have you applied in this instance the different thematic areas and areas of crisis to the different models? So what is a crisis? Well, a crisis is any incident or situation, whether real, rumoured or alleged, that can focus negative attention on an organisation or company internally, in the media, or before key audiences. When we look at the UNWTO, they actually break down in this paper different crises on the different areas, including environmental, which can include geological and extreme weather like floods, hurricanes, wildlife, tornadoes. You've got social and political events such as crime, technological events such as transportation incidences. You've got health-related events such as the SARS, salmonella, cholera, malaria, and you've got economic events such as the financial debt crisis in 2008, exchange rate collapses, and you've also got environmental humour included, ecological pollution, damage, oil spills that we've seen in the US with BP. So these we can see are a good way to look at different crises on the different sectors and headings. So what is crisis management? The term is widely attributed to US President J.F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, usually used to denote the handling of a serious, extraordinary situation. Understood as strategies, processes and measures which are planned and put into force to prevent and cope with a crisis. When we think about the different classifications of a crisis, where we're talking about potential crisis, latent crisis that may occur later, acute crisis, and natural and human induced crises. A potential crisis, an imaginary or not yet taken place. This is, the ideal base for planning and setting the crisis management goals. So, for example, now we'll move on to latent crisis. Crisis already broken out, started to take place, not yet identifiable according to normal company procedures. Normal company procedures are not yet subject to restriction. Example, on a cruise ship, some passengers have already complained of food-related illnesses, but not known how widespread. Acute crisis. Here, this is the time that the most destructive effect of the crisis is perceived by the company. Company starts to try and cope. Perception is reviewed by the company communication. An example, mass number of passengers and crew complain of sickness on board ship. Company begins to consider next moves and possible evacuation of passengers. Natural and human induced crises. Natural and induced can include weather, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, eruptions. Human induced can include politics, economic, public relations, terrorism, public order. And terrorism sector is vulnerable to both types, as we've seen in Hong Kong in 2019 and Paris in 2015. We also need to think about the level of severity of crisis events, in terms of maybe level 1, level 2 or level 3. Level 1, a localized, multiple casualty incident where in local medical resources are available and adequate to provide the field medical treatment and stabilization, including, triage. The patients will be transported to the appropriate medical facility for further diagnosis and treatment. Level 2, a multiple casualty emergency where a large number of casualties and or lack of medical care facilities are such as to require, multi-jurisdictional medical mutual aid. And then if we think about a level 3, a mass casualty emergency wherein local and regional medical resources are exceeded. Deficiencies in media supplies and personnel are such as to require assistance from state or federal agencies. So we've seen with the US, Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Here, this was a Category 3 hurricane with winds up to 120 miles per hour, hit the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Mississippi. Storm surge was 10 to 28 feet, overpowered levees and flooded large parts, 80% of New Orleans. There was over 1 million people displaced along the Gulf Coast. Rescuing and evacuating procedures heavily criticized, centers overrun, and whole districts of New Orleans ignored. Rebuilding efforts have been highlighted. Vast inequalities, French Quarter restored before local neighborhoods. So, when you're looking at, the thematic area and the crisis, you really need to go into a lot more detail in terms of exactly what happened, what was the effect of this in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the deaths, in terms of the injuries, what actually happened, and also the effect on tourism and hospitality in terms of domestic and international tourism data and figures. If we think about 9/11 in 2001, 4 hijacked aircraft, 2 flown to the north and south tower of the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 crashed into Pennsylvania into a field. 2,977 people were killed, at the 4 different sites. AA-11 from Boston to North Tower, UA-175 from Boston to South Tower, AA-77 from Washington, Dallas into Pentagon, UA-93 from Newark into field. All commercial aviation into in the USA was grounded for 3 days. There was over 123 billion of economic loss in the first 3 to 4 weeks after the towers collapsed. So again, more detail needs to be provided in terms of your research, your secondary research. So that really covers, the first questions. You need to go into a lot more detail in terms of the facts, figures, what actually happened, domestic tourism before the crisis in the thematic area, domestic tourism after the numbers, domestic tourism spend before, domestic tourism spend afterwards, and international tourism before and after, and their spend, as well as the economic impact on that area, facilities, jobs, and so on and so forth. All the information that you can find. And later on, you're going to relate that crisis to the models. The next question, talks about, communication tools and strategies. Well, I'm using a document from the UNWTO. Again, different communication tools available, if we look at them in isolation without using the models, well, include a wide variety of faxes, letters, radio, mobile phones, Twitter, Facebook, telephone, mobiles, internet, chat, and a wide range of other mediums to use in terms of different tools that are available. And all these tools obviously will have a different purpose and a different purpose to achieve a different objective. And these could then later be applied to different sections of the Faulkner and the Face model in terms of which tools you use to achieve what objective you want to achieve in the most efficient and effective way. So if we use this and we think about also the different strategies, But first, we need to look at the definition and elements of crisis communication. So, crisis is an undesired, extraordinary, often unexpected, and timely, limited process with ambivalent development possibilities. It demands immediate decisions and countermeasures in order to influence the further development again positively for the organization destination and to limit the negative consequences of as much as possible. A crisis situation is determined by evaluating the seriousness of the occurring negative events, which therein weaken and destroy competitive advantage in important goals of the organization or any destination. So crisis management is understood as the strategies, processes and measures which are planned and put into force to prevent and cope with the crisis. And when we look at crisis communication, well, crisis communication is the process, once the crisis has started, of minimizing its negative consequences for the organization and the stakeholder the organization is responsible for. It requires immediate decisions and countermeasures using all of the communication tools at its disposal in order to influence and steer its development in a positive direction as much as possible. So we can see that crisis communication does differ from non-crisis communication. We think about the communication team, crisis communication designate and active crisis communication team members and responsibilities, set frequent meeting schedules. In non-crisis communication, not necessary. If we take another example in terms of cross-functional integration, engage all organization functions into decision making, senior level approvals, hourly or daily interface with crisis communication team. With the non-crisis communication, well, not normally necessary, long-term frame. So we can see the differences between crisis communication and how it differs from non-crisis communication. So when we think about various strategies within the organization, one of the main aim is to establish an objective. An objective is to mitigate the effects of a crisis so that the visitors and other impacted are cared for and the organization's reputation and viability is maintained. The objective should be consistent with the organization's business continual plan. And the next strategy would be to identify the persons in the organization who has defined or approval strategies, positioning the message. Other strategies include identify the persons responsible for implementing the plan during the crisis. This is the go-to person for all internal questions and issues, and one which the authority for making the initial decision to activate the communication plan and its subsequent elements in the heat of the crisis. Also to establish core communication values for the crisis management team and the crisis communication team. In addition to that, you would need to have crisis management team identifying responsibilities and procedures, identifying the different members, Chief Executive Officer, Senior Operations Manager, Senior Marketing Manager, Senior Communications Manager, Senior Financial Manager, Senior Human Resource Manager. So at a minimum, the following positions are the equivalent within an organization and should be represented. And it's important to have these in place. You need to prepare and have a written objective and the responsibilities of all the team members. In addition to that, you need to prepare written procedures for the team when a crisis occurs. Develop written procedures of how the crisis team should operate during the crisis. Backup options should be prepared for the following items, which include where the team will meet, when the team will meet, who will chair the meetings, who will communicate the results, and mobile phone and internet availability 24 hours a day throughout the crisis. In addition to that, you should, as we said before, identify the key members in the organization that should communicate different messages to different parts of the organization. And additional strategies would be to prepare written, active and the responsibilities of its members. Develop specific written responsibilities so that each member will have a clear understanding of what his or her duties are. For example, a minimum assignment responsibility for the following functions: serving as primary and backup spokesperson, gathering and updating all information on the crisis, handling media, arranging briefings, interviews, and press conferences, managing websites content, maintaining media lists and contact information, managing victim family communications, assembling background information and facts on the organization, and managing internal employee communications. These are all different strategies that you would need, and then you would use the appropriate communication tools to achieve these different strategies. So we've looked at the different communication tools and strategies, and even though yes, you do need to talk about different communication tools and strategies, you also need then to relate it to the different models. So the first model we're going to look at is the Faulkner model, and the Faulkner model has 3 different sections, and we're going to look at each of these separately. So if we look at the first section of the Faulkner model, this includes 6 different elements, which is the pre-event when the action has to be taken to mitigate the effects of this potential crisis happening in the future. The pro-domo section, where it's apparent that the disaster is imminent, it's going to happen. It hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen. The emergency stage, where the incident hits, it's now occurring, it's now happening. Action is necessary to limit damage and protect people and property. You have intermediate stage. The main focus of activity is to restore services and the community to normal. And then you have section 5, which is a long-term recovery. Provision phase continues, but items that could not be attended to quickly are attended to at this stage. Long-term cleanup, repair, and self-analysis. And then section 6, which is the resolution stage. Resolution, restored or improved state created. If we think about the second stage, the crisis prevention, which is really like sections 1 and 2, the pre-event and the pro-domo. Here you do the risk analysis, the environmental scanning of what could possibly happen, using different models, using different experts within the industry to determine what could be and what measures should be taken in order to mitigate the effect of this if it did happen. And then you've got sections 3, 4 and 5, where you've got the strategic implementation. And here, the strategic implementation in terms of assessing the crisis impact, evaluating the alternative strategies, selection of appropriate strategies, crisis communication and control, more communication, tools and strategies which should have been thought about in the pre-event stage if you're looking at this potential event happening, controlling, managing and reallocating resources, and fostering collaboration with all the stakeholders. And then you have the last stage, which is the resolution stage, resolution and feedback, recitation and destination, back to normality, organization learning and feedback obtained, evaluating the effectiveness of strategies and responses that were used during the crisis to know what could be done better if this happened again. And then, again, you have the third section, which is the flexibility, and the modification of strategy. And here you look and you review and you modify. It's not just done in a straight line. If it could be done at different levels, then that would be good. So you could look and review what all the different elements and different sections once the crisis has actually happened. So if we take the crisis of the Alpine crisis in Europe, well, lots of people like to go skiing. Today, many avalanches are reported which are caused by downhill skiers or ski touring, and 90% of all avalanches are triggered by human beings. For skiers, the attractiveness of the surroundings is a strong motivation to choose a skiing destination. Thus, ski destinations must satisfy an increasing fragmenting market disposing of more and more specialized facilities and services. This has forced many destinations to explore new slopes and link to well-known skiing destinations for guaranteeing variety, scope and quality of the slopes. And we've seen that in the 80s, and there's been a high quality of strategies were developed by regional tourism planners. In addition, the rapid growth of winter tourism in the 1670s has forced many destinations to build tourist facilities in potentially dangerous areas. Before tourism conquered the Alps, the victims of avalanches were local villages. However, the number of victims among residents could be reduced by constructing avalanche barriers, but nonetheless, many severe avalanche catastrophes in the period after the Second World War. So if we think about the prevention then, and we try and apply this situation to the Alpine avalanche disaster, and really we're going to look at the first two stages first and see how this applied in terms of the pre-event and the pro-domo stages. So if we think about step one in the pre-event phase of this disaster at Gauta, the main precautions to prevent avalanches in the Alpine destinations are security precautions, avalanche barriers, and disaster contingency plans. However, many of the avalanche barriers were constructed before the first half of the 20th century, and thus were antiquated and inadequate because these barriers or avalanche barriers were built. In addition, a number of avalanche barriers were built since 1915, and they were the state of art. But in this case, this wasn't the state of art. So avalanche simulation models have been developed in the past, by calculating the number of days of fresh snowfall. But unfortunately, before the 23rd of Feb 1999, it was snowing heavily for about 10 days, and the amount of fresh fallen snow was significantly higher than the average assessed before the last 150 years. With one single month netting about 148 inches of new snow in the Gauta area. Furthermore, in alpine regions, experts defined hazardous zones as so-called red zones. In the case of Gauta, 31 victims were found in the green zones, defined in a safe avalanche zone. So why was this the case? So maybe the information wasn't updated. Maybe more models weren't used to assess changing climate and greater snow fresh fall to maybe extend the red zones to larger areas, because these green zones were potentially now in a red zone. If we think about step two in terms of the Pro-Domo stage, so here now this stage was imminent in terms of the Gauta avalanche disaster. So here the snowfall since January 27th, 1999 was heavy snowfalls. After February 16th, several roads to the valley were closed and open for a short period of time. Then resources to the Gauta area were scarce, and weather had still been bad, with snow accumulating and all the roads were blocked. Tourists were getting nervous and evacuated as soon as the roads were open and it was possible. So on February 18th, the first discussions about the crisis took place and first measures were taken. One day later, an initial crisis management team meeting was called by the district governor, and a briefing was given to a central avalanche warning commission. The need for evacuation was discussed by experts, and significant differences of opinion were expressed. In Gauta, an initial meeting was arranged to inform tourists and residents. Thereby, the community feared the worst and asked 15 doctors among the Gauta's tourists to actually help. So this was imminent. This was the Pro-Domo stage. This was before they knew it was going to happen. They were fearing something was happening because they could see the amount of snow and they could see what was happening. But still, they didn't know how far it was going to reach because they were potentially in green zones. So now we move on to, stages 3, 4, and 5. So we're going to apply the Gauta crisis of the avalanches to stages 3, 4, and 5. So we can see on the emergency stage, according to Smith 1990, at this stage it was observed how the crisis of management stage turns, into the operational crisis, where actions and processes become extremely complex. On February 23rd at 4 p.m., the main avalanche hit several houses in the centre of the village in Gauta. The avalanche started at 2,700 meters and its fracture line about 400 meters. Its snow depth was between 2.5 and 3.5 meters, and a total of 330,000 tons of snow hit Gauta, where about 8,000 locals and 20,000 tourists stayed at that time. 60 persons were buried by the avalanche. Several emergency actions were taken by the local auxiliaries. The most urgent measure was searching for persons buried by the avalanche and medical assistance for wounded. Nevertheless, 31 people lost their lives and 22 were injured. 6 residential houses were totally destroyed, 7 heavily damaged and 11 lightly damaged. The property damage was estimated at 5.27 million euros. During the day, emergency stations were established. Several local centres in the hotels and tennis court centre in the village were convened into emergency units, and 28 medical practitioners, most of them the tourists, volunteered to offer medical health services. This was in the emergency phase, when the emergency was actually taking place. In terms of the intermediate stage, well, 1 day later, on Feb 24th, the monitoring communication system was established, and all 22 injured persons could be evacuated by helicopters during the day. In addition, several external emergency teams and auxiliaries arrived at Gauta. And it was worth noting that due to the ongoing bad weather conditions in Gauta, the first external auxiliaries arrived 14 hours after the avalanche disaster occurred. The same day, a mass evacuation initiated, and military help was also put into place. The next day, February 25th, about 2,000 residents and tourists were evacuated with military help from NATO. In the following days, a mass evacuation started and was the largest ever in the history of Austria, with 2,500 emergency helpers, 47 helicopters and 782 flight hours, and another 8,000 evacuated people. On Saturday the 27th, after the last victim was found, the first official press conference was organised in Gauta, with 100 selected journalists flown in by helicopter and another 200 journalists waiting for information in a nearby city outside the valley. Afterwards, Gauta was not open to the press anymore. International media pressure was extremely high, and Gauta had no experience with such a situation. Media communication was poor, managed, and misrepresentation of the disaster followed. The next day was proclaimed a day of national mourning. And now we move on to the stage 6, the resolution stage, resolution and feedback. Moving on to stage 5, long-term recovery phase. Long-term recovery phase, only 2 weeks after the disaster, the financial support provided by donations and the government funding. In Gauta, there were no disagreements about the allocation of the donations. Communication strategy here included a hotline established by the Tyrol Tourism Board. Internet was seen as the most appropriate communication channel within the first months after the disaster, but Gauta tourism entrepreneurs focused on direct contact with guests for conveying the security and safety measures and improvements. Marketing resumed just 2 weeks after the disaster. In this phase, Gauta struggled with criticism from the media, and targeted marketing measures were seen in much more efficient than overall broad and unfocused. So this could have been a lot better in terms of how this was handled, in terms of the marketing communication and the marketing message and the marketing strategy. And if we think about the last stage, the resolution stage, It took 1 year to re-establish, routines in the community. The review process, which is characteristics, of the resolution stage, has improved, existing products and processes such as disaster contingency plans and risk assessment. You know, protection measures and improvements in the fields of safety and security have been deployed for the resort. Better for more avalanche barriers, improved avalanche protection and access to the roads from Gauta. So these things were put into place at the resolution phase, stage 6. In addition to that, there were a number of new services and products developed during the resolution stage, also improved the tourism and value chain for customers. So again, things like the avalanche barriers for multifunctional buildings informs tourists about the avalanche disasters in the past. The institution systematically collects data about natural alpine disasters and fosters networking with other institutions in the field of this disaster management. On the other hand, this new building is an architectural and entertainment attraction for tourists, and on the other hand, it provides safety and security for the center of Gauta. And also another organization was a non-profit Alpine Safety and Information Center, ASI, was established to promote safety and security in the mountain environment. Its goal was to provide communication bridge to all participating institutions and local organizations. So we can see here at stage 6, the resolution stage, action was being taken and things were being put into place to kind of make the whole process more effective and efficient if this was to happen again, and to mitigate the potential of these risks happening. So in the learning outcome talks about theoretical approaches, which is plural. So we need to take at least 2 models. So we've looked at the Faulkner model, and now we're going to look at the phase model, where the phase model has 4 sections, which is the disaster phase, the post-disaster phase, the recovery phase, and the pre-disaster phase. And within the disaster phase, you've got when a disaster is taking place, housing provision, crisis capability and emergency management, and emergency response and rescue and relief. This leads on to helping creative structure, and then the post-disaster phase in terms of leadership in charge, arrival of tourists and community events, housing prevention, a short-term response, rehabilitation, rebuild, redevelop, which leads on to energizing the community in terms of the recovery stage, networks, destination management organization support, recovery marketing, and new tourism, and leading towards the center, long-term strategy and renewing. This leads on to collaboration, and then the pre-disaster to mitigate the these disasters happening again, and moving towards the center. You have being prepared in terms of prevention and mitigation and what that will entail. So let's have a look at an example and see if we can apply this. So if we apply this to the case study of the Great East Japan earthquake, tsunami in 2011, and this was an earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan with a magnitude 9 earthquake, the largest in Japan's recorded history at that time, and a number of devastating tsunami waves hit northeast Japan on 11th of March 2011. The maximum height of the tsunami was 17.6 meters observed in Okinawa. An area of more than 507 kilometers squared was inundated. The total reported toll in Japan was 15,683 people killed and 4,830 people deemed missing, with 27,000 people were rescued. So we're going to try and apply this, and you see how in here there's more data, facts and figures and stats and information which are being applied to different stages. So if we look at the emergency response stage, with the emergency actually taking place, shortly after the earthquake and the tsunami occurred, the Extreme Disaster Management Headquarters team were deployed. Immediate emergency remedial action was taken, rescuing victims, creating shelters, and restoring damaged infrastructure. Government response and aid teams and businesses, as well as individual community members, all played significant roles in coordinating first aid and organizing rescue in the shelters. This phase of the disaster life cycle was especially characterized by chaos and extreme complexity, requiring spontaneous, instinctive, and quick decisions. In the post-disaster phase and the short-term response, after the phase of immediate emergency management, the disaster life cycle transits into the second phase, the short-term response phase. The transition from the emergency phase to the short-term response phase is chiefly aligned with progress towards the respective objective of emergency solutions achieved by government, emergency teams, aid workers, and helpers. The data showed that for Japan disaster, this stage was characterized by the restoration of infrastructure components such as water, electricity, people being moved to temporary housing, and the rebuilding of public transport. And if we think about it again in this stage, the short-term response phase, again within this disaster phase, it's necessary to support, the movement from the transition period to the next phase of recovery. So the results from this study revealed that a huge effort needs to be undertaken in order to move from this stage to the next stage. So when we look at this case in Japan, tourism is a major impact of the period of activation. Firstly, the arrival of dark tourism, the offering of short storytelling tours help the community to heal, feel empowered and stimulated. Secondly, tourist and residential events brought people together. The data analysis indicated that participants believed that it was the forming of groups which assisted the community to overcome depression. The collective approach not only to help to heal the individual, but it also energized community members to collaborate and transit to the next phase. So it's more information. It's not just saying, oh, we move from stage one to this stage. It's actually more detailed, and more things need to happen and more things need to be put into place and to help people to be able to transition who are still living in that area and affected by the mental scars of this disaster to move on to the next stage. Otherwise, they won't successfully be able to move on. And if we think about, if we get people now to move on to the recovery stage, long-term continuous development, so here it becomes obvious that the consequences of disaster would lead to both structural changes in the region's industry and to cultural changes. With the transition into the next life cycle phase, the recovery phase, interviewers identified that there were some changes due to the closure and destruction of businesses. Small accommodation providers gave up and turned to fishing. Hotel managers, so often as infrastructure had been destroyed or employees had been harmed or moved away after the disaster. Moreover, damage and destruction had reduced, extinguished businesses. Before the disaster, there were 45 accommodation providers. After, there were only 10. So, again, we can see that it's not just easy to rebuild everything. It's not just easy to start off again within this sector because things have changed. There weren't as not many businesses, people had moved on, and people had been physically scarred, so they could no longer stay in that area. So in the pre-disaster phase, in terms of preparing, here it's the purpose of learning and building knowledge from the previous phases of the disaster recovery cycle. The aim is to reflect upon lessons learned which are relevant to the disaster, in terms of being prepared. This study showed that tourism made major contribution to all stages of the disaster recovery cycle and therefore needed to be integrated into all the phases. The implications for disaster planning and preparedness are that tourism needs to be better integrated into the disaster management process. Moreover, in order to be more effectively prepared, the response to disaster hospitality managers needed to be incorporated into the community emergency management. In this case, the Japanese disaster and the data showed that hotels were conducting their own fire drills. However, they were not yet integrated into a broader emergency plan, and they needed to be combined into these teams in terms of disaster training, because they themselves were the main people at that stage in terms of taking in people into the hotels and helping people out and dealing with them and dealing with this crisis and disaster. And they seem to be outside of the scope in terms of the emergency disaster team. So again, within preparedness and the pre-disaster phase, it's very important to learn the lessons of the disaster and to integrate it into all the different sections. So what have we covered today? So we have covered obviously what is required in coursework 1, assignment 1, which is a poster viva with 10-minute questions, 1500 words plus or minus 10%. And you really need to cover the learning outcomes in terms of the minimum 2 thematic areas. You can have more, but when you're talking about the thematic areas and the crisis, you need to really go into detail. You need to go into more detail, and you need to put it all on one poster. You need to use in-text referencing and also provide a reference list. With regards to question 2, we're looking at the relationships between different thematic areas and areas of crisis and linked to tourism and hospitality. And you must give the details. The domestic tourism before, international tourism before, domestic and international tourism afterwards. What were their spend? What was the impact on infrastructure? What were the effects on businesses? And how much did it cost that area? And what were all the details of the crisis and the thematic area? So you need to provide all these details. And later on, you need to integrate these into different sections and parts of the Faulkner and the phase model. And then you have the communication tools and strategies. Again, we broke down, you must break down communication tools and communication strategies. You know the different communication tools, and you've got the article from the UNWTO, and then the communication strategies, which again, if you looked at the Faulkner model, can be used at different sections of the Faulkner model. And again, as well as explaining it, you must integrate it into the models. And then finally, we looked at the 2 models. So the learning outcome 3 says to apply theoretical approaches, which is plural. So you need to make sure you take 2 models. So I'm suggesting the Faulkner model and the phase model. And you need to explain the different sections and their subsections, and then relate your area of thematic area and crisis to the Faulkner model, because the word says to apply. You can't just explain the models, you must apply crisis thematic areas to the models, and also apply your communication tools and strategies in terms of what would be used and when. So I hope that has helped today from Mr. Tan. Thank you.